Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome to today's program Arun Samuga, who is Chief Technology Officer at Elemica. And today we're going to talk about blockchain and supply chain management. Now, over the past 2 years, there's probably been no other technology that's gotten as much hype and probably has generated as much confusion, as blockchain. Why is there so much interest in blockchain technology? Where are we today with blockchain in terms of its adoption and, case studies and examples out there? And, will blockchain replace or be complementary with existing network-based platforms that are out there? Well, those are some of the questions that we're going to discuss in today's episode. And it's great to have Arun back in the program to share his insights and perspective on this topic. So Arun, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks a lot, Adrian. I'm glad to be here, and as usual, it's a pleasure talking to you.
Well, like I said, certainly been a lot of buzz and hype around blockchain technology over the past couple of years, especially as it relates to supply chain management. So, as a way to get started, why so much interest? What potential value does blockchain bring to the industry?
I think fundamentally, when you think about buzz and hype, it's a result of interest. It's a result of something that's triggering expectations in people's mind. And I think what's happening with blockchain is more and more people are able to see some extended possibilities, not just purely from a technology standpoint, but the broader repercussion as it relates to businesses and society at large. So it's that interest driven by the possibilities that's creating a lot of hype. However, when you talk about reality, then you need to look at things with the lens, right? So, if you go back 50 years ago, or even 100 years ago, supply chains were very simple. They were local in most cases. But now if you look at the situation or the landscape, it's very, very global, and it's extremely complex. So think of a product that goes from one place to another. It changes hands. It undergoes transformation. If you're in the process industry, there are various actors involved in the process, and any such process calls for very high levels of visibility, transparency, and of course, reliability. It needs to occur consistently in a manner that it's expected to. So that's the supply chain space. And then you look at blockchain, and what does it do? It comes along and it guarantees consensus. It guarantees immutability. It comes with unprecedented levels of security. So those three elements together actually directly correspond to provisioning a high level of reliability and integrity that's needed in the supply chain. So for example, there's no dispute in the chain regarding transactions because all entities are looking at the same thing. Now, of course, Bitcoin came in and created a lot of buzz as a cryptocurrency. However, if you look at blockchain as a technology in itself, you're talking about a distributed digital ledger, right? So many applications can use it, that they have the same copy of the data. They use that for exchange. They use that for agreements. They use that for contracts. You can track the movement of goods, information. And of course, its primary use case that's been successful is payment. So every transaction is recorded on a block, multiple copies on a ledger, extremely secure. So it's very obvious, or it's a natural extension in the human mind to extrapolate it to increases in efficiency and transparency and look at it very positively from an impact perspective, from all the way from inventory management to proof of delivery to invoice payment. Three critical aspects of a supply chain. And I think one last thing I'd add there is, we talk about autonomous supply chains as being this, the ultimate realization of truth, if I may, as it relates to supply chains from a maturity perspective. However, if you look at competing technologies in terms of maybe slightly old vendor-managed inventory to auto-replenishment to more recently, Internet of Things, machine learning, of course. If you take each one of these technologies by themselves, they cannot enable a fully autonomous supply chain. You need these to work in tandem. You need IoT for data gathering. You need machine learning to treat that data in order to add intelligence to it. and of course come up with forecasting models so as to either prevent issues in the future or mitigate risks. But ultimately, things need to be traceable. And that's where blockchain fits very well. So there's a lot of talk about blockchain, even as it relates to the autonomous supply chain discussion in general. So with regards to whether it's a hype or not and where it's ending, I mean, the more it becomes commonplace, the more likely supply chains are going to be able to reap the benefits, and more it will be evaluated for its impact and less for its hype. And that would be where I'd leave that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think whenever there's a relatively new technology, if you will, I mean, you know, the potential discussions or the ideas of how it can be applied, you know, certainly outpace, you know, the adoption, if you will, and the learnings that come from, actually testing, these technologies out. And I think you're right. I mean, obviously from a supply chain standpoint, the fact that supply chains have become much more global, much more, outsourced, if you will, they become longer and so forth, many more trading partners involved, a lot of transactions having to take place between suppliers and buyers and logistics service providers and customs agencies. I think on paper, it lends itself to all the characteristics that blockchain brings to the table that you talked about, the security element, the transparency, and so forth. And I like the way you brought it in within kind of some of the broader trends that we're seeing out there, discussions that are, in terms of the autonomous supply chain, machine learning, IoT, because these are all things that ultimately, will have to work together, or will have to be, part of the future state of supply chains if these technologies ultimately get to that point where they mature and start to, deliver some of these promises. So let's talk about, on that journey to getting to the possibilities. I mean, where are we today in blockchain adoption and supply chain management? Any success stories?
I would say, at a high level, it's mostly in the use case definitions, pilots, a proof of concepts kind of stage. I've not heard of a great successful blockchain story. Now, it may ultimately be a good solution for some types of supply chain problems, but I believe it's not yet ready for mass adoption because till date, I mean, we've not yet proven the technology's unique value, if I may, to the supply chain sector. I mean, there's a lot of competing technologies that kind of does what blockchain is promising on doing, right? And then we'll talk about, public and permission blockchains in a little. However, when you look at full transparency and traceability, there are solutions currently in the business to business space specifically that already tackle it. Now, can they be improved? Of course. Do we need to replace it completely with blockchains? Maybe not. But the gap between blockchain's current capacity and the capacity that supply chains in general need is enormous. So Gartner has an interesting tagline. I think it says, "You're blockchain inspired, not blockchain enabled," which I think is true because, going back to the public versus permission blockchains, that's where a lot of this nuance comes about. So you can think of it as, public means anybody can access it. Permission or private means a restricted group of people by invite only can access it. Now, even within that, there are nuances around open versus closed. So you could have a combination like public, open, public, closed, permission, open, permission, closed. And what that means is, if it's open for reading and writing. If it's closed, means it's open for writing, but not for reading. So then you can come up with different use cases, right? So if you break it down further and rationalize it into, say, the B2C space versus the B2B space. So in the B2C space, you'll see, and if you think B2C, public, open, if you drill it down to that level of specificity, then you start looking at Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin. So treat everybody equally. There's more anonymity. There is no one owner. Everybody is equal because everybody should have the equal rights to exchange Bitcoins. So you get into that spectrum, right? But on the other side, now if you think about permission blockchains like Hyperledger, R3, Corda, Quorum, more suited for business to business type activities where identity is extremely important. Who reads and writes data is governed and controlled. You want as many people to write, but you don't want as many people to read, because they could be pricing information, they could be capacity and quantity information. So there's various nuances and different levels of information as it relates to supply chain data exchange and collaboration, that for me to say that public blockchains will just come and take over whatever is happening, it just sounds unreal. Now, permission blockchains, though, I think there are some good use cases. Trade lens blockchain solution, I think IBM and Maersk recently embarked upon it. They boast of millions of transactions, which is all great. The transaction layer is the first step. How do you translate that to value, right? And you and I have spoken about scones and digital supply networks. We all start there. We start by exchanging data in the name of collaboration, but then we need to build on top of it in order to really enable end-to-end visibility, traceability. Now, finance was a very, very easy use case because it's just a transfer of funds. It's party A to party B. Be done with it. There's not like 20 people who need to be paid. So it was an easier use case to prove from a blockchain perspective. But I think another interesting use case that's gaining more popularity is in the food and bev space. I think Walmart in the retail industry is testing a blockchain solution. I think it's called Food Trust. And it's basically trying to test food safeties with leafy vegetables so that ultimately the consumer knows where the problem area was. So, and on the third angle, I would say there's a lot of technology providers out there who are opening up blockchain as a service. They're basically saying, we'll build a blockchain solution for you, and so on. So I do see a lot of moving parts around the entire ecosystem, not only of supply chain providers, but of supporters of supply chain and technology providers. So I see it coming, though I see it coming very, very slowly, just because of a lot of issues that need to be taken care of upfront.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of great, points there, and kind of the nuances of what makes kind of blockchain and supply chain management kind of, more challenging, let's say, or some unique requirements that have to be addressed, from that standpoint, and the different permutations, if you will, of how this technology can be deployed. I mean, I've seen similar types of things as well. Obviously, you've highlighted some examples there with Walmart and Maersk and so forth. And I've seen, pilots that have shown some successes, if you will, but they've been on a relatively speaking on a small scale, right? So, generally what I've seen is they've involved the very largest trading partners, right? So Walmart and very large suppliers, right? On embarking on testing this out. But the reality is that, as we all know, it's the 80-20 rule, right? 80% of the trading partners out there are small and mid-sized businesses, right?
Absolutely.
And I haven't seen yet, very small companies that may still be operating on, Excel spreadsheets, or they may still be operating on very outdated technology and so forth, getting plugged into this. So I think, ultimately, to make this a broad adoption, it needs to be something that not only the very large players in the industry use and have access to, but ultimately it's something that could be affordable and easily deployed by, the smaller, companies as well. And obviously that's where, the technology providers have a role to play here. So you talked about technology providers kind of getting involved with this. I mean, is Elemica participating in any blockchain initiatives? Are these being driven by some of your customers?
That's a good question. I mean, we are actively working on two blockchain projects. One of them, the first one is focused on supplier financing. You can also think of it as factoring of invoices. So we partnered with a company called Centrifuge, who's our technology partner for blockchain services, and we are working with a company called CRX, who is the consortium of the financial institute. So the goal is, if a supplier sends an invoice to the Elemica network to any of the buyers, then we are able to create a fingerprint using our relationship with Centrifuge, and then we're able to post it into CRX markets as an asset, as a token, as an asset for invoice factoring, and it's an invoice factoring marketplace. So that will invite the financial institutions to actually provide some financing options for the suppliers, so suppliers ultimately can get funded earlier than the traditional payment cycles from these financial institutes, and then they get there's reconciliation with the buyers and so on. So the potential of minted non-fungible tokens to enter a token economy is pretty huge in that route. So that's something we're excited about. So that's the first project. The second project is more classic invoice automation, if I may. There are two of, I would say, Elemica's large chemical companies on the network who embarked upon a process where they exchange a lot of invoices amongst each other because they buy and sell from each other. So at the end of the day, if they're processing, as an example, 20 to 30,000 invoices a month, you can just imagine the amount of processing that needs to occur on both companies, accounts payable and accounts receivable. So what we are trying to say is come up with this concept of netting and post everything on the blockchain. We're using a colder blockchain, and just cut one invoice at the end of it, or do a delta at the end of the month, so that you take the pain of invoice processing away from it. It obviously falls under the broader bucket of executing an order to cash process on the blockchain, but I would say invoice netting is probably a subset and a good way to quantify that exercise. And both of these are trending in parallel. I think we should hopefully have some go live announcements early next year. And in addition, we recently acquired a company called GSQA, a quality management company. And as you can imagine, with raw material quality management, the ability for us to extend it to identifying maybe more value-based use cases in the areas of product provenance, lot lineage tracking, I think it just opens it up very nicely for us to get into those areas as well. So from our perspective, yes, we are there. We don't want to lose out on the race, but I think we are there cautiously, but with optimism.
Yeah, those are great examples, and I think that's what I've seen from a lot of other technology companies as well that are are working on blockchain. They're usually linked to some key customers that they're working with that are interested in blockchain as well, and see how within their current relationship and their current processes they can start leveraging this in some of these use cases. So those are some great examples there. Now, as we've talked in the past, and I've been a big proponent of, supply chain operating networks or digital supply chain, digital supply networks for a long time. And I view blockchain as a potential new operating system for, existing networks, while others might view blockchain as as a replacement. I mean, what's your perspective? I mean, do these things, could these things coexist, or is blockchain going to replace the other?
Well, I must admit that that's a question that's been that was bogging me down for a while. But then we took a step back and we tried to look at it holistically, and of course nothing is static, right? I mean, even the supply chain operating networks or digital supply networks, they continue to evolve. It's not like we just did EDI transactions and then slowly moved on to providing visibility and then moved on to providing intelligence. Of course, that was a journey that we undertook. However, if you look at Elemica in its current state, not only do we exchange transactions between systems, that's something that's a given. However, we moved pretty rapidly into providing end-to-end visibility, cross-process visibility, and now we are talking about IoT, getting data directly from devices in terms of temperature, decibel levels, and so on. For specific products that are going between buyers and suppliers. We've added machine learning services onto our network. We've opened up a couple of solutions where we do edge computing. So, and then now we are interoperable with a few other networks, including Ariba. So, supply chain operating networks and digital supply networks are evolving. So let's keep that on one side. Now, blockchain on the other side is also evolving. But its evolution is more towards getting to a steady state. I mean, it's nascent. So for us to look at one replacing the other now, I would say is a little premature. So in the short term, I don't think there's a chance of replacement at all. I'll give you an example, right, with numbers. So for example, when Elemica transforms data, we store it in our cloud platform, and then we obviously process the data. We do data enrichment, we do validations, we apply rules, and then we deliver it through our patented universal business document technology. So let's talk about cost of storage. So if we imagine that we have to store 1 GB of data, and say for the sake of comparison, we have to replicate it in Amazon Web Services using S3 storage, as well as Microsoft Azure using blob objects for say 100 years. Okay, it's going to cost you $75 for 1 GB to store across 2 different geographic regions in 2 different cloud providers for 100 years. Now let's do a comparison on, say, Ethereum. Okay, the cost of Ether, as it was pegged against as it related to the USD, was about 700. I think $700 a few years ago, and then now most recently it's at 191 or say $200. So on one hand, it's a variable to begin with. A few years ago, for a similar storage on Ethereum, we're talking $175,000, so 2,300 times the amount it would take for me to do it using the current tools at my disposition, or maybe around $50,000 using the current rate of Ether, so which is about 700 times what it costs me now. So I'm not going to replace the message storage in a blockchain, in a public blockchain for sure. And then you think about processing, right? I mean, Visa network, which is probably one of the most network with the most amount of concurrency and traffic, they do 24,000 transactions a second. And Ethereum, I think, boasts of about 15 transactions a second. So by the time you put these data storage requirements and processing requirements, now when you put that together, there's no 1:1 replacement at all. Now, will we see a gradual shift in that direction? I think so. I mean, as the cost of storage, cost of processing in the blockchain technology improves, and that's one thing about technology, it continues to improve. So, people will start realizing that there are certain aspects of a digital supply network, certain functional or application silos, if I may, that may lend itself better for blockchain technology. So unless we are talking about everything in this universe being managed through public blockchains, I think Elemica is in a good position to extend its current services to provide blockchain as a service to our existing trading partners for some of the specific applications where it makes a lot of sense.
You brought up those examples there in terms of scalability and processing time and cost is kind of brings me to my next question, which is going to be about what are the current challenges and hurdles out there. But I think you're right. I mean, I think it underscores, I think if you're talking about using blockchain to send the equivalent of EDI 214 transactions, I mean, it just doesn't make sense, right? Because I mean, it's you're talking pennies, relatively speaking, to tens of thousands of dollars, right? And that kind of realm, if you will. It's just from a cost and scalability standpoint, those are still hurdles that are out there. I mean, what other hurdles or challenges exist out there that blockchain must overcome in order to, reach its potential value in supply chain management?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately somebody has to write the check, right? So the cost benefit needs to be there. And unfortunately, it's too early to estimate the costs of operating blockchain technology in the supply chain world in its existing magnitude. But then, you compare it with other technologies, it's very easy to come up with a price. I mean, Elemica is able to easily price and offer a value in return for the price for a given service. And that needs to happen with blockchain first. So people need to, the value proposition needs to be very clear. And in order to do that, we need to identify what are the transactional efficiencies, what are the cost savings in terms of, say, end product failures, what's the business problem you're trying to solve, how much money can you save by tackling the issue around recalls, product recalls, maybe around litigation. Now, would a consumer pay more for a product that offers this level of transparency throughout the supply chain? So once we get some clear yes and no answers to those questions, and you look at companies' willingness to participate. Now, some companies just want to be part of a buzzword. I've seen that. So, ultimately it takes a motivated team with clear goals to pull off successful outcomes. So in a nutshell, I would say it's a combination of, what are the value props? What is the clear benefit? What is the associated cost? And focused participation. If we have those pieces lined up, I think that's when you would have tackled some of the biggest challenges that blockchain faces currently.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. Well, Arun, we're getting short on time here, so I'm just going to go right to my last question. I mean, as a way to wrap up, I mean, how do you see the role and adoption of supply chain, of blockchain and supply chain management evolving, over the next few years? And what advice would you give to companies to make sure they keep pace, with these developments?
So, one thing I would like to say about blockchain is that it is a captivating technology. So, unlike other technologies, blockchain has broad repercussions in terms of not only the technology in itself, but its impact to societal rules, governance at large. So, once there are a few successful use cases, I think we will notice faster adoption. So, my recommendation is companies should be on the lookout for tackling specific use cases where it makes sense for adoption, and invest cautiously, but definitely invest. I mean, it may take another 5 to 8 years for some aspects of it to be really mainstream, but I would say I would urge companies to allocate a modest research and development budget for specific use cases. If not for anything, at least just to stay abreast. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, that's a great point. I always tell folks, especially in this day and age, staying informed and keeping a pulse on what's happening across the industry in general. So obviously on the technology front with things like, blockchain, on the regulatory front, obviously everything that's happening with, China tariffs and Brexit and so forth. I mean, this is one of those industries where you have to, stay informed and keep up to date in terms of what's happening because it's moving so quickly. And the last thing you want to do is, you may not want to be, on the bleeding edge of things when it comes to technology, but you certainly don't want to be, it's becoming riskier these days to be a complete laggard, right? So you want to make sure that, you're keeping pace at least, and you've got your toes in the water at a minimum with some of these things. So I think that's some great advice. Well, Arun, like I always say, we always manage to scratch the surface on these topics, and certainly with something like blockchain, we could probably have like a whole 3-day conference on this whole topic. But I think you provided some great insights and perspectives on this topic. So again, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity. As usual, I like talking about technology, and I like talking to you as well, Adrian. Thanks a lot.
Great. Well, it might be interesting to maybe touch base a year from now and see how much progress or what changes have come about in this whole area. So, again, I want to thank those of you that joined us today. If you're watching this on demand at the Elemica website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Arun, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.
Thank you.